New merch now available at www.horses.land. Africa contains just 16% of the total world population, but Sub-Saharan Africa has 67% of the global number of people living in extreme poverty. Half of the African population lacks access to essential medicines. Stats like these just kind of go on and on. You've probably heard them all before. But they bring up a lot of questions. If Africa is so broken, how did it get that way? How can an entire continent be in such a destruction? And all of these statistics about an impoverished, suffering Africa, are they even true? Is the Africa of the Western eye even remotely close to actuality? It is a confounding set of questions, but there are plenty of answers. The thing about statistics is they don't always tell the whole story. The U.S. June jobs report just came out, for example, and 57,000 jobs were added, but forecasters expected 115,000. Here's the interesting part. One headline frames this as far worse than feared. U.S. economy loses 60,000 hospitality jobs. The same day, another headline came out. Unemployment falls to 4.2% as economy adds 57,000 in June. Same report, same day, two very different stories. So are the job numbers good or bad? That depends entirely on who you're reading. They're all looking at the exact same report, but somehow publishing completely different conclusions. If we pull up the story on Ground News, we can see 334 different sources covered this one report. Ground News lets me compare those headlines side by side so I can actually see how different outlets have framed the exact same jobs report. With the context Ground News gives me, the pattern becomes clear. The difference in framing is largely along political lines. Right-leaning outlets portray the job numbers more favorably, while left-leaning outlets are more critical. This is a great example of why I love Ground News. It can be truly revealing to see how political biases impact every bit of news we consume. Viewers of this channel may have noticed a pattern over the past 2 years now. Ground News has been my only sponsor. That's because I'm not really interested in promoting predatory gambling companies or landfill-destined plastic gadgets. I genuinely believe in the work that the team at Ground News is doing, and I believe more people should be using the service. Unlike other platforms, they don't push or suppress stories to influence your perception of the world. Their platform prioritizes giving readers full transparency on today's issues by pulling in the world's perspective on them, providing sources' history of failing fact checks, and even who's benefiting from you believing their version of a story. When it comes to news, finding the truth is really getting more difficult every day. I sincerely believe Ground News can help us right the ship on this whole issue. Ground News is fully independent and supported by readers like us, but I partnered with them to get my viewers 40% off the same Vantage plan I've been using. Go to ground.news/horses, click the link in my description, or scan my QR code to get a great deal on the Vantage plan with all the features I just mentioned. By signing up, you're directly supporting the work I do here and your ability to think critically. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of it all, there is an idea which we should be sure to forget. The concept of Africa as a uniformly ruined place composing of only failed or failing states. In fact, we should forget the idea of Africa as a uniformly anything. Africa is a massive continent made up of 54 different countries which all have their own achievements, failures, solutions, problems, and situations. Many of these countries are successful, politically stable, and economically robust. These statistics about Pan-African famine and poverty, they are true, but really there is a handful of very poor countries statistically dragging down the whole of the continent, while outliers on the other end do not fit this mold at all. For example, Botswana has managed its diamond wealth very well, reinvested in its population and infrastructure through strong institutions and fairly stable democracy. Mauritius is Africa's leader in GDP per capita wealth by some measures, managing a well-diversified economy with stable democracy and consistent institutions. Ghana has seen stable growth and carried out peaceful transitions of power for decades now. Morocco, Seychelles, Namibia, and Kenya are other examples of African countries which are successful by many modern metrics. Of course, none of these places, and indeed no places at all, are utopian. That isn't the point here. Instead, that the idea of Africa as a monolithic place teetering on the brink of collapse is profoundly untrue. Africa is many different things, and it is not some wasteland that needs saving. This is an important point, and it is one we will come back to later in this video. Still, while much of Africa thrives, there is certainly hardship on the continent in remarkable concentration and severity. This is owing not to one thing or the other, but a veritable hailstorm of different forces, which almost no other region on Earth has had to endure simultaneously. For much of history, Europeans stayed out of the African interior because of disease, logistics, and danger. Then technology came about. Advances like medicine, steamships, and repeating rifles made inland conquest feasible in ways it hadn't been earlier in the century. By the mid-1800s, Western Europeans had already been purchasing or kidnapping slaves and resources from coastal Africa, but now they wanted more. There were a few reasons for this, most importantly, and least surprisingly, money. Europe was quickly industrializing, and it wanted raw materials like rubber, minerals, and diamonds. Europe was also seeking new markets for domestically manufactured goods. Africa seemed like an untapped source of both. There were two geopolitical ideas at play. A nation's colonies were a measure of its power and prestige. For European nations, Africa would serve as an arena for international rivalries. Lastly, many Europeans believed themselves to have a civilizing mission. They were obligated to bring Christianity, education, and modernization to the whole world, Africa included. Some may have actually believed this idea, certainly. For others, it was a combination of racism and moral cover for what often became pure exploitation. In any case, the major European countries all sat down in Berlin in 1884 at what is now known as the Berlin Conference. These nations were trying to figure out how they could all colonize and conquer Africa without going to war with one another. Notably, no Africans were present at the Berlin Conference. Many African states had already signed treaties with individual European powers which regulated trade, commerce, and European exploration within their lands. At the Berlin Conference, European nations often ignored, reinterpreted, or completely violated these prior agreements. The European countries eventually settled on a principle of effective occupation, a phrase that was deliberately broad and could be molded to include all kinds of meanings and intentions. It essentially created a permission structure for countries to confiscate large swaths of foreign land. Under this principle, European powers could claim authority over a region for a wide range of reasons that did not always require an agreement with local rulers. To colonize an area, a country needed to do just two things: inform other European nations and prove they had established some governance, forced or otherwise, in the colonized land. Ultimately, the Berlin Conference did not go so far as to dole out pieces of Africa, but this proved to be no matter. Combined with the existent slave trade, the Berlin Conference legitimized the idea that Africa and its resources were to be taken, and that the continent existed for outsiders, not Africans. Here, narratively, we run into a problem. 52 of Africa's 54 present-day countries were colonized by Europeans following the Berlin Conference. A person cannot possibly do justice to all of these stories in one entry. But what a person can do is select a few which carry the hallmarks of Europe's colonizing disasters. And so we begin with Nigeria. Before Europeans arrived to the area which would later become Nigeria, the region was a pretty well-functioning set of societies with no shared political or cultural identity. It was not utopian, but it was operating with all the perils and successes of any group of societies living with shared borders, interstate trade, war, diplomacy, and rivalries. The first Europeans to arrive in the region were the Portuguese. They sought to buy slaves from the natives, then resell them to Europeans in the New World for profit. Then came the French, Dutch, Swedes, Germans, Spaniards, and finally the British. Chiefs and African people ensured that European contact with the Nigerian region was limited to coastal areas for many decades. For the native Africans, allowing Europeans into the interior would interfere with their own profitable position as middlemen between interior slavers and the Europeans. But then, in 1807, the British Empire abolished slavery. After slavery, the British Empire was keen to keep exploiting its relationship with West Africa, and indeed exploiting the continent itself, for the same reasons as their European neighbors. They wanted to remain competitive, they wanted resources to use and markets to sell to, and they already had a well-established African trade network. In quest for these goals, the British efforts were not peaceful or kind. For example, when the King of Lagos refused to sign a treaty with Britain, they bombarded the island with warships, quickly took control of it, and installed a puppet ruler. It was around this time that the Berlin Conference took place. Britain came out of that conference with the European-granted right to the region of Nigeria. The British indeed conquered the area, and for several years ran its northern and southern regions as two completely separate political and administrative entities. At the time, the Northern Protectorate of Nigeria was running via subsidy from the Southern Protectorate. The North was in fact operating at a loss. It cost more to run than it produced in tax or trade revenue. For the British, this just wouldn't do. In 1912, Colonel Frederick John Dealtree Lugard became the governor for both northern and southern Nigeria. Peers described him as unsympathetic, mean, and spiteful. Lugard arranged to combine the northern and southern parts of Nigeria into one colony. This has since been called the Amalgamation, and it was done basically as a bookkeeping move. By combining the two colonies, the South could subsidize the North rather than the North receiving money directly from London. This idea was met by the local people with strong resistance. These people could see that it was an economic move which would serve to enrich colonists and government leaders. Simultaneously, it would lump together a vastly diverse group of people who had no interest or benefit to being one unified colony. But Lugard's plan went on. The amalgamation artificially constructed a state without the consent of those people who lived there. This produced a country which was fundamentally not united by anything in particular, including the very existence of their own country. Indeed, Nigeria was not made for the African interest, but for the economic interest of Britain. As a result of this, Nigeria never really had the opportunity to function as a true singular nation. This ostensible unification actually just created a nation which was dangerously divided. All of the different populations in Nigeria had their own ruling customs and traditions. In some places, the British allowed local custom to stay as a cost-saving measure, while London ruled indirectly through pre-existing Nigerian leaders. In other places, Britain invented new authority structures that had no basis in local tradition. This mismatch bred serious resentment, rivalries, and suspicion among these disparate groups in Nigeria. It all does bring up a question, however. Throughout history, many nations have begun as mere conveniences of geography, full of diverse groups, and eventually emerged with a successful sort of national unity. The United States itself is among these, and it became a global superpower. Why did this not work for Nigeria? Lugard's amalgamation did not seek internal peace or unity. That just wasn't the point. Instead, it was pacification and British economic gain. Amalgamation was based on indirect rule, governing mostly through existing local authority structures rather than imposing a single, uniform British bureaucracy. So even after amalgamation, Nigeria was still divided into separate colonial territories, each with their own administration. These territories were deliberately kept separate in legislative manners. Lugard believed it would be too costly to unify the regions under a new government. Amalgamation was purely a financial measure. The aim was not to create a unified nation, but to make resource extraction cheaper and more efficient. The British began building massive amounts of infrastructure, all of it designed to extract and export resources rather than serve the locals or develop the nation in any broad, long-term way. They built railways for the sole purpose of moving cash crops. They grew coastal port cities as commercial hubs. The British turned the southern region into a large urban and commercial center. As for the agrarian north, there was little economic incentive for its development, so the British essentially didn't bother. For years, British missionaries had been providing English Christian education in Nigeria. This education really only existed so the Nigerian colony could produce people to work in clerical and administrative roles within the British Empire. Still, it was the only way for Nigerians to advance their place in society. But after amalgamation, the British worried that building their Christian schools in the Muslim north would disturb their indirect rule by spreading Christianity to the region. So the British did not provide education for the northern Muslims. What few schools they did construct in the north were poorly attended. The Muslim leaders did not want their people receiving explicitly Christian education. This, of course, created a huge gap between the development of the north and south regions, a gap that in fact still exists today. Furthermore, post-amalgamation, government staffing and the elite classes became dominated by educated southern Nigerians who advocated almost exclusively for southern interests. Aside from the tangible development gap, this unequal education created a deep resentment towards Southerners from northern Muslims. Amalgamation also deepened regional and ethnic political blocs rather than creating a national political identity. Nigeria's later political parties would indeed form along the exact regional lines that the British maintained for 46 years, rather than uniting around any ideologies or policies. Over the following decades, the South was divided again into two regions, and so post-amalgamation, Nigeria functioned more or less as three vastly unequal societies, all of which felt a deep distrust towards one another. These societies all had different religions, different forms of government, and most importantly, a huge British-created gap in education and opportunity. This was all in the context of them being forced to exist as a nation and compete over the same very limited resources and political power. Towards the middle of the 20th century, Britain's calculus on their empire began to change. They had just come out of World War II and were deeply in debt. They simply could not afford a global empire the way they had before the war. India's independence in 1947 set a precedent that perhaps the British Empire was coming to a close. Furthermore, Nigeria was now home to a rising organized national movement which was demanding self-rule. The USSR was also sending messages about colonialism as antithetical to the Western ideal of freedom. Britain decided it could exit Nigeria while still keeping the country in the Commonwealth, thus retaining economic benefits, including the opportunity to profit off newly discovered oil in the Niger Delta. The transition to independence was relatively smooth. There were no wars, there was no bloodshed, and a new Nigerian government was put into place without much issue. But for 50 years now, Nigeria had existed as separate, unequal, disconnected societies. The nation had no experience actually functioning as one state. Independent Nigeria was still split into 3 regions, each with their own premier, elected House of Assembly, and House of Chiefs. The northern region was more populated and larger, so it had more power than the other 2. This left minority ethnic groups and regions very angry. You may notice something here. Independent Nigeria doesn't actually sound too much different than Britain's Nigeria. Indeed, when Britain granted Nigeria independence, they really just handed over the country's problems, which they had created, to its people. Government officials didn't like each other or their citizens. Citizens didn't like government officials, and citizens didn't really like each other. It was becoming something of a powder keg. Cost of goods skyrocketed after independence. Federal ministers and parliamentarians had raised their own salaries, while ordinary workers saw no equivalent wage increase, despite a government-appointed commission recommending an increase in the nation's minimum wage. The result was a strike of 800,000 workers, which eventually broadened from unrest over wages into an attack on government corruption. In 1962, a Nigerian census revealed that, for the first time, the northern region contained a minority of the population. Southern politicians celebrated the result since it implied southern regions could now get more seats and more revenue, while northern politicians outright rejected the census. From the north, there were accusations of fraud. The prime minister canceled the census and had it retaken. The new numbers happened to find a much higher population in the north, which was just enough to preserve its majority. Again, of course, there were more allegations of fraud. The census mattered not only for legislation and organizing, but because government funding would be distributed based on population. Other regions refused to accept the new census. Independent researchers also rejected the numbers as inflated. Despite this, the federal government adopted it and allocated based on the inflated numbers. The feud over the census almost dismantled the already fragile Nigerian government. But really, the problems were just beginning. A general election occurred in 1964. Again, alliances formed to advocate for Nigeria's various regions. One of these alliances called for a boycott, saying that the elections were rigged. The boycott happened, in part. In some areas, voting took place just fine. In others, polling stations were chaos. In the entire eastern region, no one voted at all. After it looked like the northern region had won, the sitting president essentially refused to allow a new government to be formed. So for several days, the president's term was up, but no one had been permitted to take his place. For those days, Nigeria genuinely did not have a government. The president eventually gave in, and the new regime took control. The following year, a regional election in western Nigeria descended into disaster. The problem was that the Western party in power was allied with the federal government, so they controlled the police and the vote-counting infrastructure. There was no independent referee. Rigging wasn't just possible. It was almost baked into the election. Polling places mysteriously ran out of ballots. Party members were seen stuffing hundreds of ballots in random boxes. Candidates had to be held at gunpoint to keep them away from ballot-counting areas. Things turned much more violent. Nigerian rioters invented the weti, a practice in which a person and his house or property were sprayed with petrol and set ablaze. Towns burned down, people were hacked to death by machetes, and political parties set up roadblocks and held drivers at gunpoint. Law and order had broken down. Nigeria seemed to be on its deathbed. The census figures had been the first shot across the bow of Nigerian political stability, causing massive disillusionment among the populace. The strike almost crippled the economy permanently. The disastrous elections just added more fuel to an already raging fire. Corruption existed on every level of the Nigerian administration. Politics became harshly tribalized between dominant groups in the north and south, while minority groups were left out of virtually all planning and decision-making. In the years that followed, Nigerian export profits, particularly from oil, skyrocketed. But virtually all of this money went into the pockets of political elites rather than improving the welfare of the deteriorating nation. On January 15, 1966, the country broke. A military coup stormed across major cities and toppled the Nigerian government in its entirety. The leader of the coup suspended the constitution, dissolved the government completely, and declared martial law. Most of the officers in the coup were from the same region, and whether it was true or not, many people saw it as a power grab by that region rather than some kind of anti-corruption move. Northern officers staged a counter-coup in July of 1966 and installed a new head of state. This was followed by a much darker development. Waves of mob violence ethnically targeted civilians in the north through mid to late 1966, killing an estimated 8,000 to 30,000 people and triggering a mass exodus of over 1 million people fleeing the region. That year, the eastern region of Nigeria then seceded and became the Republic of Biafra. The Nigerian government responded with military force, and the preceding civil war lasted 3 years. Biafra was gradually blockaded and starved into surrender, with death toll estimates between 1 and 3 million. Biafra surrendered in January 1970 and was reabsorbed into Nigeria. All of these things were consequences of Nigeria being a nation that probably never should have existed, and the various disparate groups in the country being virtually frozen out of Britain's ostensible nation-building efforts. And after 1970, there were more consequences to come. Things kind of just got worse. In 1956, oil was found in Nigeria, but about 15 years later, after an OPEC embargo in the early 1970s, the price of oil essentially quadrupled overnight. Nigeria made a lot of money riding this price surge, but the nation and its people, its regular people, saw virtually nothing but strife as a result. The oil and oil money didn't really create jobs in a meaningful way. Oil extraction doesn't require the broad mobilization and employment of a country in the way that actually creating things does. It is a profitable endeavor, but not a hugely labor-intensive one. Another issue emerged. The country and its economy became oil-obsessed. Agriculture, which was once Nigeria's main export, completely collapsed. Most other industries did the same as the government neglected infrastructure and development in favor of profitable oil exportation. To put a point on this, Nigeria's infrastructure was so lacking that the country was unable to even refine their own oil. They could only sell crude oil, which was profitable, but they also had to export crude oil to be turned into gasoline, which was then re-imported to the country at a premium paid almost entirely by the Nigerian consumer. Meanwhile, Nigerian governance became less a pursuit of the nation's well-being and more a dogfight among the elites to get as much oil money as possible. Whether it was a coup, an election, or a political campaign, everyone was just fighting to control the oil. Nigeria inherited weak colonial-era institutions, courts, civil service, anti-corruption bodies. These institutions were never built to handle the scale of oil wealth suddenly flowing through the nations. The money from the oil was very real, but the country lacked any mechanisms or institutions which could turn that money into development for the Nigerian people. Nigeria's problems with oil are an example of the resource curse theory, the idea that countries with abundant natural resources actually end up more impoverished, corrupt, and conflict-prone. This theory hinges on the way wealth can change the relationship between a government and its citizens. Typically, a government earns revenue from taxing a productive employed population. But resources like oil, diamonds, and minerals produce money from foreign companies and extraction royalties, so the government can become very wealthy without an employed, educated, or productive population. Whether citizens prosper or not, the government can keep earning money. Resource wealth also tends to outcompete other parts of an economy, causing those other pieces to wither from neglect. Wealth becomes hyper-concentrated in one industry, and political battles become fights for control of that one resource, as happened in Nigeria. The resource curse is not a universal law, but just a frequent phenomenon. Chile has abundant copper and has managed it very well. Norway has lots of oil and they have done just fine. But these places had strong institutions and governance implemented by the time they discovered their resources, so the systems were in place to turn that wealth into prosperity. Throughout the 20th century, Nigeria proceeded through cycles of coups, corruption, and disorder, mostly along lines drawn by its oil money. Nigeria found stable democratic government in 1999 and has stayed that way since. Today, the country is a mixed bag. It is more or less economically stable, but still struggles along the same colonial fault lines. The north is a region of poverty and violence, while the south is relatively stable. An indigenous ethnic group is currently campaigning for secession. The government still struggles to turn oil money into prosperity. Nigeria is just one country on a vast continent, but when we look more broadly across the African continent, we do see many of these same patterns playing out time and time again. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Democratic Republic of Congo was known as the Kingdom of Congo. It was a semi-democratic society living according to tradition and custom. But after the Berlin Conference, King Leopold of Belgium took the Congo for himself, not as a vassal state or colony, but as his own legal, personal property. Leopold claimed that he wanted to bring progress and prosperity to the region. In practice, he looted the Congo. His entire operation was centered around extracting as much wealth as he could in the form of resources like rubber and ivory. Leopold invested money only into trading posts and trade routes without spending a penny on local infrastructure or support. He utilized enforced labor rather than wage payments among the native Congolese. During this era, historians estimate Belgium killed anywhere from 1 to 10 million native people in the Congo. Missionaries present at the time claimed to have witnessed public murders of the chiefs or their relatives by European agents, the rape or abduction of women, mutilation, scenes of cannibalism, and forced public displays of incest. This lasted in various permutations up until and through the time the Congo was transferred into Belgian government ownership. Like Nigeria, Congo eventually fought and gained independence, but also, like Nigeria, the Congo found itself in a deeply troublesome scenario. It was a tremendously resource-rich state, newly independent without the infrastructure, systems, safeties, or knowledge on what to do with any of it. And so today, the Congo exists in much the same way. It is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, yet the Congo consistently ranks near the bottom of the world in metrics like food security, safety, and human rights. In 1575, the Portuguese militia invaded Angola and began to colonize the region for resources. After the Berlin Conference, Portugal controlled most of the nation. During their tenure, the Portuguese administration utilized forced labor in diamond mines, and heavy taxation while providing the Angolan people with virtually no social benefits or formal education. Indigenous people were required to speak fluent Portuguese and somehow maintain economic independence, or they were subject to forced labor. The social structure implemented by Portugal divided the Angolans into a rigid, formal class system. In turn, this created extreme inequality and long-lasting effects on the nation's economic and social environment. After a few coups and decades of scattershot wars, Angola was eventually granted independence in 1975, only to find itself immediately being used as the setting for larger nations' proxy conflicts during the Cold War. And just like the other examples, Portugal failed to provide any support for the transition to independence and thus created virtual anarchy within the nation. A civil war immediately broke out along ideological divides. The war lasted for 25 years and came alongside numerous humanitarian catastrophes, including mass rape, starvation, and genocide. The Civil War eventually ended in 2002, with an estimated death toll between 500,000 and 1 million people. The stories of post-colonial struggles are mirrored in Sudan, where British European rule forced a Muslim North and a Christian South into one territory with almost no attempt to integrate them. This ultimately produced Africa's longest civil war. In Libya, Italian colonization merged three culturally and politically distinct regions into one artificial state. Libya eventually split into rival governments and militias fighting over oil revenue. Similar sequences have occurred in Cameroon, Ethiopia, Somalia, Mali, and Sierra Leone. The pattern has been quite clear: colonizing nations operating African regions primarily for resource extraction. They then vacate the region, while never having implemented any systems or infrastructure for good governance. There is certainly a counter-argument here. For most of these countries, colonialism ended 60 years ago. Couldn't they have just figured it out by now? Other nations in other parts of the world have. Other nations in Africa have. After all, colonial nations didn't force any African leaders to execute rivals, massacre citizens, or accept bribes. The point is not that struggling African countries can reasonably blame all of their problems on colonial meddling, but it is certainly true that these colonial policies fundamentally changed the House of Africa. They created nations and incentive structures which were deliberately conceived to benefit foreign entities rather than native citizens. The leaders of the African countries were not forced to make poor decisions after independence, but they were forced into situations where those poor decisions were liable to be made. Indeed, in some cases, they made them. However, there is another matter at play. The geography of Africa makes it a very difficult place to develop a nation. Africa has lots of rivers, which are generally good for trade and economic development, but many of these rivers in Africa prove difficult. The Congo has violent rapids near the coast, so sailing from the ocean to the interior is impossible. The Nile has similar issues. Africa's coastline is unusually smooth, without as many natural bays or harbors as other continents, which means there are fewer places which are well suited to become port cities. All of this means that simply moving goods from other continents into Africa becomes expensive and difficult. It is a small issue in itself, but compounded over centuries, the result is huge amounts of lost trade and economic development. There are 16 landlocked nations in Africa, more than any other continent. A landlocked nation suffers a heavy burden when it comes to trade. Every single import and export must cross through a neighbor's territory. That means additional tax, additional infrastructure to navigate, and dealing with any delays caused by instability in that neighboring country. In fact, economist Paul Collier has identified landlocked with bad neighbors as one of the strongest predictors of long-term poverty. Even the best governance and policy can easily be nullified by a hostile or dangerous neighboring nation. Then there's the worry of disease like those carried by the tsetse fly. These diseases wreak havoc on livestock, specifically draft animals. Without draft animals, it is difficult to develop large-scale agriculture. Farming stays small and labor-intensive instead of quickly building the kind of surplus that has fueled urbanization and state building in other parts of the world. This is just a theory, and it is one that has been criticized. For example, critics note North Korea and South Korea. These two countries share virtually the exact same geography and clearly have experienced vastly different developmental trajectories. It is unlikely that geography is to blame hugely for the struggles in certain African countries, but geographical challenges can be seen as a multiplier of other problems. Institutional failures have been worsened and compounded by the continent's difficult terrain. And there is just one more problem, but this one is not with Africa. It is perhaps with the rest of us. In the satirical essay, How to Write About Africa, author Binyavanga Wainaina identified and mocked a series of tropes in the Western and European perception of the African continent. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book, or in it, unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. An AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts, use these. If you must include an African, make sure you get one in Maasai or Zulu or Dogon dress. Establish early on that your liberalism is impeccable and mention near the beginning how much you love Africa, how you fell in love with the place and can't live without her. Africa is to be pitied, worshipped, or dominated. Whichever angle you take, be sure to leave the strong impression that without your intervention in your important book, Africa is doomed. Broad brushstrokes throughout are good. Avoid having the African characters laugh or struggle to educate their kids or just make do in mundane circumstances. Throughout the essay, Wainaina pokes and prods at a very real issue. This monolithic, almost self-congratulatory lens through which Western people tend to see Africa. He also hints at the resource extraction which has plagued so much of the continent, as he says, quote, "Anybody white, tanned, and wearing khaki who once had a pet antelope or a farm is a conservationist, one who is preserving Africa's rich heritage. When interviewing him or her, do not ask how much funding they have. Do not ask how much money they make off their game. Never ask how much they pay their employees." Wainaina's points should be well taken. Africa is not a monolith, and it must not be portrayed as one. There are plenty of thriving countries and success stories to be found on the African continent. 11 of the world's 15 fastest growing economies are in Africa. Kenya was the birthplace of M-Pesa, a mobile money system which allowed millions of unbanked people to exchange money years before that was possible in the West. The Democratic Republic of Congo, for all their struggles, is currently working on the Grand Inga Dam, which will be the single most powerful electricity generation project in human history. Nigeria produces more movies every year than Hollywood. These success stories are not outliers or footnotes. They are very much a part of the continent. Poverty in Africa exists, of course, and we should not pretend it doesn't. But it is one thing for poverty to define an entire continent, and another for poverty to exist in pockets and parts, just like it does in any other place with over 1 billion people. To lump all of Africa together is like saying that the United States is riddled with hurricanes because Florida has hurricanes. In the West, we have tended to portray Africa quite simply and bluntly, and it is true that these portrayals are often designed to elicit sympathy for some ultimately charitable cause, but repeating these depictions of Africa time and time again may have a negative effect. We might actually believe them. We might actually believe in a broken version of Africa. It is possible that by seeing Africa as some dystopian place that we are reducing our own interest in cultural and economic exchange with the entire continent. Colonization, exploitation, and reckless resource extraction have proven to be profoundly effective ways to ruin a continent. But so too is this third strategy, to believe that it is already ruined.